A lot of people have always asked me, well, did you hate Richard Nixon? No, I didn't. As a matter of fact, I was indebted to him for having worked for me. It was only after I found out what he'd been up to that I turned around.
Did you ever feel any pressure to support Nixon as one of the three Republicans?
Oh, sure. Sure. Well, I mean, you feel pressure in the sense that number one, obviously, my colleagues on the Senate floor were not particularly pleased with some of my earlier comments about the president. The White House itself, into the investigation, went ahead and brought different forms of pressure to bear, whether on family or on me personally. It was a bare knuckles fight. Make no mistake about that. And at the outset, it was just looked upon as partisanship. I'm sure the Republicans thought the Democrats were partisan, and Democrats thought the Republicans were being partisan in defending the president. And indeed, as you know, at the outset, Howard Baker and Fred Thompson, who was the then counsel, actually communicated quite freely with the White House, with Mr. Nixon. And again, when they found out as to really what was involved, then they cut those lines. But at the outset of the investigation, everybody was trying, I'm sure, to do an honest job, but it wasn't without its partisan politics.
Were you the one who convinced John Dean to testify?
No. John Dean had been talked to by the committee very briefly early on in the investigation. But what had happened was that having done that, he sort of disappeared from view in Washington. And a lot of people really feared for his life. They couldn't find him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and they just wondered, well, hey, what's happened to this guy? Through a series of contacts I had, I made contact with his attorney. And I asked if I could sit down with Dean and have a chance to talk to him before he came before the public eye in his testimony. That meeting was arranged at night in a house in Maryland. And I sat down with him, and the first thing he asked me, as a matter of fact, was, he said, Senator, he said, aren't you a little bit worried about your own position? I said, well, why? He said, well, I know the White House thinks they have some very damaging information on you, which they won't hesitate to go ahead and use if you pursue this thing. And I said, John, nothing I know of I've done wrong in my life, so let's go forward. And I interviewed him, got a flavor, in other words, of what was to later become public testimony. And we became very close friends. We actually lived across the street from each other, as things turned out, right here in Old Town Alexandria. We both lived on Quay Street. I across the street, and during the course of the proceedings, we wouldn't hesitate to sit down and talk. It was during one of those talks, as a matter of fact, that I unearthed the enemies list, what became known as the enemies list. Dean was a very courageous young man. I know a lot of people think, no, he ratted on the administration. I don't think so. I just think it got to the point he was willing to play politics as played. But once it crossed the bounds, in other words, of irrational behavior and unconstitutional law-breaking, that's where he drew the line. And then he just set it all down as to what had been going on. And I admired him for going ahead and doing it. And certainly he was a key part of the investigation. He was a key reason why all these other matters fell apart.
You mentioned the enemies list. Can you talk more about that and how you found it?
Well, it was one of our evening conversations. I wandered across the streets. It sort of sounds strange on something sort of monumental national event, but we were neighbors, and we used to sit down and have a drink with each other. And it was the end of the day, and I was out of duty of the Senate, and he was at home, and sat down and talked. And a lot of the testimony had already been set forth. And I turned to him and I said, well, John, is there anything else that you can remember that you think might have something to bear on the psyche of this administration? And he sat and he thought, and he said, well, I got one thing. He said, I don't know if it really has any particular relevance. And he produced this list, in other words, which was the enemies list as set forth by Richard Nixon. And, you know, I mean, that's unfortunately for us and also unfortunately for the president. This is the way he viewed people that disagreed with his point of view. They were enemies. And it's a state of mind that I think exists too much in politics on both sides, but he really formalized it, I'll put it that way. I mean, it's one thing to have an opponent and to disagree with people and try to beat somebody in an election. But I don't know, I don't think I've ever in my lifetime, in any election I've run, and I ran 13 of them, ever considered somebody my enemy.
At what point did you first suspect that this was more than what Ziegler called a third-rate burglary?
Boy, that's a tough one. I think talking to the Cubans, talking to Baldwin, who had situated himself at the Howard Johnson across the street, it was clear there was an organization to this. And also when we had testimony from McCord, it was pretty clear to me that this was not just, you know, just a haphazard break-in. This was very well organized and very well financed. And then with the contacts that I made, the information I got from, let's say, Patrick Gray, who was the acting director of the FBI, or other people that had been on Nixon's staff, it became clear that first that there was a cover-up going on. Of what sort of came later. But that there was a cover-up going on. If there's a cover-up going on, then there must be something pretty, you know, extensive and malodorous going on that they're trying to cover up. So once you're onto the cover-up, then obviously you keep digging to find out exactly what that was. And in some ways, you really didn't find out. You found out about the various events that took place, but confirmation came, of course, when they discovered the tapes in the White House. And
was it at that point, or before that you realized that the president?
Oh no, it was long before the tapes. As a matter of fact, I'd written my report before the tapes were discovered, and quite frankly, about 98% of my report was right on the money as to who had done what and when. I mean, I'd pieced it all together. When the tapes came out, that was confirmation, but it far from altering anything that I had thought or said, it just confirmed it.
Did you have a specific point, or was there anything that...
Well, my point was that the Constitution of the United States had been torn to shreds. I mean, you know, the use of the FBI and of the IRS and of the various agencies of government to go ahead and achieve political ends, it was just monumental. And his disdain for the American people and obstruction of justice and defining what the obligations of the president are. I mean, the Constitution was what had been ripped to shreds and had been torn down and disrespected by Richard Nixon. And that to me was, that's what was saved. During the course of the hearings, I know that I clashed with Ehrlichman, and finally the administration, having run out of excuses as we presented the facts to them, he turned to me and he said, well, he said, look, Senator, he said, maybe these things happen, but then everybody does it. That was the critical moment in the hearings, both for the committee and for the American people. Because if you concede that point, then you lower the bar of politics in the United States to the gutter. And the fact that we didn't concede that point that everybody does it, maybe some people did, but we were unwilling to accept that as policy. That was a critical point in the hearings.
Can you take some time to discuss the role of leaks in Watergate, either from the committee or from the White House, or how did all these leaks play a role?
Well, leaks, I think, is not the term that I would use. I can only speak for myself. I can't speak for what either Dash and the Democrats did or what Thompson, Baker, whatever they did, or what the White House did. I can speak for myself. Did I, from time to time, put information out there through the press? And the answer is absolutely. Don't forget, number one, I wasn't a Democrat. Number two, the Republicans in the committee didn't trust me. And number three, I had a great deal of information which was rock solid that should be brought forth. And the press, in the case of Watergate, really was doing a hard-nosed and a precise job. Not like today. I have to say the press runs with stuff that is totally unsupported. But they were doing a lot of very good investigative work, as we were doing our investigative work. And sometimes, for fear that whatever information I had uncovered would either not get produced by the Democrats in the committee or derided by the Republicans, sometimes I just put it out there. And listen, if the information had not been right, certainly I would have been crucified. But I was sure of my facts, and I want to make sure they got out to the American people. So I did not consider that a leak. I consider it, very frankly, a service on the part of the American press that they were going to go ahead and get the truth out. As you know, there were many times that there was information released by the Democratic majority, which I never heard about as a member of the committee. And there were other times when the Republicans were in communication with the White House, and certainly I wasn't privy to that. So I was in being of an independent mind in a very ticklish situation where my neck was on the line, but how was I going to go ahead and communicate? And
did you find that for the most part, I think you mentioned the press did their job during Watergate?
Yeah, I think they did a job during Watergate. I think there's the ramification of that today is that the press doesn't do as much of a job as they did at that time, and a lot of times run with stuff which really is very unsubstantiated, and I don't admire that at all. That doesn't mean to say there aren't Pulitzer Prize winners out there and people that do their investigative work, but in general, every single reporter thinks he's Woodward and Bernstein. Well, Woodward and Bernstein, they did a lot of spade work and a lot of heavy lifting, in other words, to get to where they got. And I'm not so sure that spade work and heavy lifting is necessarily a part of the media culture today.
What was your relationship, or did you have one with Woodward?
None.
No?
None. No, none. I mean, I knew the people of Washington. I knew Ben Bradley. I knew Katharine Graham, one thing or the other, but really none with Woodward and Bernstein. I think that's important because neither would I do the press's job for them. A lot of reporters would call me and say, "Would you ask such and such a question during the hearings?" I said, "No, I won't." I said, "I'm not here to go ahead and represent you," and I think it would have been a mistake for me to establish a relationship with Woodward and Bernstein, who were pressed, and I was the legislative branch of government. So I know the answer is I didn't. I think maybe once, maybe twice, I got a call from one of them saying, keep going because you're right on the nose and one thing, but no exchange of information between the two of us, and neither would I go ahead and carry the mail for the press of the hearings.
In June of 1974, the committee released it was a 7-volume report on the presidential campaign activities, and you, as you just briefly mentioned, wrote an independent summation. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about your report, and did it differ at all? Or
Yes, it did differ, because what it did, without being immodest, what I did was to relate every single act of wrongdoing to a specific section of the Constitution of the United States. And that, to me, in other words, was what the exercise was and should be all about. If I had to suggest to anybody, if you want a good synopsis, a very brief synopsis of what Watergate both was and what was at stake, read my individual report, and I'll save you reading the other 20,000 pages of the Watergate report. What worries me, of course, about all this is that, yes, it did the job in the mid-'70s, but I worry today that many of the lessons that we were supposed to have learned then, it's clear to me we haven't. And that's why I even said then, I said, look, this isn't the last Watergate. We're going to have many of these challenges. And it depends whether the country rises to the occasion.
What were your personal thoughts as you watched President Nixon's resignation speech and his White House departure that we all remember watching? What were your personal thoughts as you saw that?
Good riddance to bad rubbish. I mean, did I want to go ahead and put him and or the nation through the humiliation of the impeachment? I'm glad he resigned. I wasn't out there to go, for blood, if you will, wanting to see a public humiliation in a formal legal sense. And neither did I want to see this country absolutely handcuffed by one revelation after another of scandal. So I think it was the right thing for him to do, and I think it was a good thing for the country.
And then after that, what about President Ford's pardon of Nixon? How did you feel
Well,
about that?
that's a different story. I disagreed with that pardon at the time. I disagreed with it. I thought it was wrong. In reflection, I think he did the right thing. I think he wanted to just heal the wound and get on with life, and I think he was right. And I also have to tell you, if you asked me in terms of my own career, of having served under quite a few presidents, Ford included, who I think the greatest president of the United States was, I'd pick Jerry Ford. He had good common sense and ability to work with the Congress, high moral values. I think he was just plain outstanding. So, I know many of my friends that watch this tape, who are ever here, will say, hell, when did Weicker ever admit he was wrong? Well, I'm admitting I was wrong right there. I think Ford did the right thing in pardoning Nixon.
In the end, what, if anything, positive came from Watergate, from the whole affair, the whole era?
I don't think any more than winning that particular ball game at that time, blocking that shot. If you ask me, we still have an understanding of corruption in politics and an understanding of the value of our Constitution today any more than we did, then. No. America had fallen to a great silence back in the 70s with Vietnam and Kent State and a lot of the other occurrences, and we just weren't raising our voices. And we're not raising our voices today. I mean, until finally the Democrats found their backbone a couple of months ago, this administration was riding roughshod all over the range without anybody saying no. Well, finally the Democratic Party and some of its candidates did find their backbone, so they're saying no. The United States, the system of politics that we have in the United States can only operate, now by that I'm referring to the two-party system, if the two parties contest each other. If one of them just lies down and plays dead, then, it's no different than dictatorship or monarchy. And I suppose the lesson from all that is, as Ben Franklin said, in this country, he said, the people rule. And when they don't, which they haven't been, thanks to 46% turnouts at national elections, the thing goes to pot. I won my last election as an independent. I beat both the Democrat and the Republican. I think you're going to find more of that in the United States as both parties fail to fulfill their obligations and only go by the polls, rather than have it a contest of ideas. And there was no contest of ideas back then when Nixon did all of his hanky-panky. And up until recently, there's been very little contest of ideas here in the United States.
More than a century ago, in a time of great national trial, Abraham Lincoln told a troubled and bitterly divided nation, "We cannot escape history. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the last generation." Today, we're again faced with a national trial. The American people are troubled and divided again. And my colleagues on this committee know full well that we cannot escape history. That the decision we must jointly make will itself be tested and tried by our fellow citizens and by history itself. The magnitude of our mission is awesome. There's no way to understate its importance, nor to mistake its meaning. We have unsheathed the strongest weapon in the arsenal of congressional power. we personally, members of this committee, have felt its weight and have perceived its dangers. The framers of the Constitution, fearing an executive too strong to be contained and constrained from injustice or subject to reproof, arrayed the Congress with the power to bring the executive into account and into peril of removal for acts of treason, bribery, or other crimes of and misdemeanors. Now, the first responsibility facing members of this committee was to try to define what an impeachable offense is. The Constitution doesn't define it. The precedents, which are sparse, do not give us any real guidance as to what constitutes an impeachable offense. So each of us in our own conscience, in our own mind, in our own heart, after much study, had to decide for ourselves what constitutes an impeachable offense. Obviously, it must be something so grievous that it warrants the removal of the President of the United States from office. I don't agree with those that say impeachable offense is anything that Congress wants it to be, and I don't agree with those who say that it must be an indictable criminal offense. But somewhere in between is the standard against which we must measure the President's conduct. There are some who say that he should be impeached for the wrongdoing of his aides and associates. I don't concur in that. I think we must find personal wrongdoing on his part if we're going to justify his impeachment. The President was elected by an overwhelming mandate from the American people to serve as their President for 4 years. And we obviously must be very, very cautious as we attempt to overturn this mandate and the historic proportions that this deliberation have. After a member decides what, to his mind, constitutes an impeachable offense, he then had to decide what standard of proof he would use in trying to determine whether or not the President of the United States had committed an impeachable offense. Now, some have said that we're analogous to a grand jury, and a grand juror only need find probable cause that a criminal defendant had committed an offense in order to send the matter to trial. But because of the vast ramifications of this impeachment, I think we need to insist on a much higher standard. Our counsel recommended clear and convincing proof. That's really the standard for civil liability, that or preponderance of the evidence. And I think we need a higher standard than that when the question is removing the President of the United States from office. So I came down myself to the position that we can have no less a standard of proof than we insist on when a criminal trial is involved, where to deny an individual of his liberty, we insist that the case against him be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. And I say that we can insist on no less when the matter is of such overriding import as this impeachment proceeding. I started out with a presumption of innocence for the President because every citizen of this country is entitled to a presumption of innocence. And my fight for fairness on this committee is obvious to my 37 friends and colleagues who I think will corroborate that I was as outspoken as any member of this committee in calling our very fine staff to task when I thought they were demonstrating bias against the President, when I thought they were leaving from the record parts of the evidence which were exonerating of the President. I fought with the chairman and the majority, with some of my colleagues on this side, insisting that every element of fairness be given to the President, that his counsel should sit in on our deliberations and offer arguments and evidence and call witnesses and My friend from Alabama mentioned that earlier, Mr. Flowers. But he will also have to confess that most of these concessions to fairness were made only after partisan dispute and debate, which is what our whole legislative process is about in the Congress. So I don't concede to anyone on this committee any position of fighting harder and stronger that the President get a fair hearing of the evidence. And while I do have some individual specific objections to isolated incidents of unfairness, I think on the whole the proceeding has been fair. Now, I'm a Republican. Party loyalty and personal affection and precedents of the past must fall, I think, before the arbiter of men's action, the law itself. No man, not even the President of the United States, is above the law. For our system of justice and our system of government to survive, we must pledge our highest allegiance to the strength of the law and not to the common frailties of men. Now, a few days ago, after having heard and read all the evidence and all the witnesses and the arguments by our own staff and the President's lawyer, I came to a conclusion. And I felt that the debates which we began last night were more or less pro forma, and I think they've so far indicated that. I feel that most of my colleagues before this debate began had made up their minds on the evidence, and I did. So I saw no reason to wait before announcing the way I felt and how I was going to vote. I read and reread and sifted and tested the mass of information, and then I came to my conclusion that Richard Nixon has, beyond a reasonable doubt, committed impeachable offenses which, in my judgment, are of sufficient magnitude that he should be removed from office. Now, that announcement was met with a great deal of criticism from friends, from government officials, from colleagues in Congress. I was accused of making a political decision. If I had decided to vote against impeachment, I venture to say that I would also have been criticized for making a political decision. One of the unfortunate things about being in politics is that everything you do is given evil or political motives. My friend from Alabama, Mr. Flowers, said that the decision that we make is one that we're going to have to live with the rest of our lives. And for anyone to think that this decision could be made on a political basis with so much at stake is something that I personally resent. It isn't easy for me to align myself against the President, to whom I gave my enthusiastic support in 3 presidential campaigns, on whose side I've stood in many a legislative battle, whose accomplishments in foreign and domestic affairs I've consistently applauded. But it's impossible for me to condone or ignore the long train of abuses to which he has subjected the presidency and the people of this country. The Constitution and my own oath of office demand that I bear true faith and allegiance to the principles of law and justice upon which this nation was founded. And I cannot, in good conscience, turn away from the evidence of evil that is, to me, so clear and compelling. My friend from Iowa, Mr. Maine, detailed some of the allegations against prior administrations And I don't in any way question that. I agree with them that there was wrongdoing on the part of previous presidents, maybe all presidents. But I was not in a position where I had to take a stand, where I approve or disapprove of blatant wrongdoing. And I am in that position now. My friend from New Jersey, Mr. Sandman, said last night he wants to see direct proof, and some of my other friends on this side of the aisle have said the same thing. But I submit that what they're looking for is an arrow to the heart, and we do not find in the evidence an arrow to the heart. We find a virus that creeps up on you slowly and gradually until its obviousness is so overwhelming to you. Now, he's asked for direct proof. I think it's a mistake for any of us to begin looking for one sentence or one word or one document which compels us to vote for or against impeachment. It's like looking at a mosaic and going down and focusing in on one single tile in the mosaic and say, I see nothing wrong in that one little piece of this mosaic. We have to step back and we have to look at the whole picture. And when you look at the whole mosaic of the evidence that's come before us, to me it's overwhelming beyond a reasonable doubt. Let's look at the President's own words. He uses the words cover up and cap on the bottle and the plan and containment, and he's concerned about what witnesses have said and what they will say. He's concerned about where the investigation is going. Now let's focus in on the thing that everybody talks about, the Hunt payment. Let's look at this as reasonable and prudent men. What did Mr. Hunt intend? His payments and demands had been relayed through his wife before her death. After his wife, he had to make them directly. So what did he do? He called Colson to make demands, and we have a transcript of what he said, and I want to quote. This is a long-haul thing, and the stakes are very, very high, and I thought that you'd want to know that this thing must not break apart for foolish reasons. We're protecting the guys who are really responsible, but at the same time, this is a two-way street. And as I said before, we think that now is the time when a move should be made, and surely the cheapest commodity available is money. And then he went and he talked to Colson's lawyer, Bittman. And to Bittman, he told him the same thing, that commitments were made, and he would blow the lid off the whole thing unless the money was paid to him. And then he went and saw O'Brien, the attorney for the committee to re-elect the president. And he said to him that he had to have $60,000 for legal fees and $75,000 for family support. He said if he didn't get it, he would reveal a number of seamy things that he had done for the White House, and if things didn't happen soon, he'd have to review his options. The man that was making those demands had over $200,000 in the bank that he had collected from his wife's insurance. So I asked my colleagues on the committee, what would the reasonable and prudent man assume that he had in mind? It's obvious he intended to blackmail the White House. Well, now let's go inside the White House and let's see what they say. They talk about this. Can we raise $1 million? You know, is this the way to go? Will there be other demands from them? How were the payments made in the past? These are the President's own words. He says, well, can we handle it through the Cuban committee, the way we handled it before, indicating already knew about the previous payments made. These are his own words. And then he says, wasn't that handled through the Cuban committee? And John Dean says, well, no, not exactly. That's not the way it was. And the President says, well, that's the way it's going to have to be. Is this an urging to conceal the truth, or is it not? So the payment was made to Hunt. And it doesn't matter to me whether the President approved it before it was made. A conspirator, as all we lawyers know, can get in on a conspiracy at any point, even after the fact. So it's immaterial whether or not the point in time when he said, okay, I approve it, you pay it. The fact is, and the thing that's so appalling to me, is that the President, when this whole idea was suggested to him, didn't in righteous indignation rise up and say, "Get out of here, you're in the office of the President of the United States. How can you talk about blackmail and bribery and keeping witnesses silent? This is the presidency of the United States." And throw them out of his office and pick up the phone and call the Department of Justice and tell them there's an obstruction of justice going on. Someone's trying to buy the silence of a witness. But my president didn't do that. He sat there and he worked and worked to try to cover this thing up so it wouldn't come to light. And the FBI is conducting an investigation. So he says publicly, "I want to cooperate with the investigation and the prosecution." But privately, all his words compel a contrary conclusion. He didn't cooperate with the investigation or the prosecution. And it's already been said by some that Henry Peterson called and he said initially in the conversation, "Well, it's not going to go any further. I know I have to keep this secret." He had no sooner hung up the phone when he was telling the defendants about whom this damaging information was made, what they could do to counteract the case that the prosecution had against him. Well, I could go on and on and on. I'm surprised that some of my colleagues, the telephone call from Pat Gray. Pat Gray was a man who did many things wrong. He was loyal to his leader. But at some point his conscience bothered him, and he wanted to tell the President of the United States that his aides were destroying the presidency.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Give the gentleman an opportunity to finish his sentence and his thought.
I appreciate the Chairman. That Pat Gray called the President to tell him that his aides were destroying the presidency. And instead of the President saying, "Well, give me more information about this. I want to know if my aides are doing anything wrong. I want to know." And Pat Gray says in his testimony, there was a perceptible pause. And the President said, "Pat, you just continue to conduct your aggressive and thorough investigation." He didn't have to know because he already knew. And he consistently tried to cover up the evidence and obstruct justice. And as much as it pains me to say it, he should be impeached and removed from office.
We've been talking about Watergate, but Watergate was really only one of three. That is, three instances in U.S. history where the Congress has either impeached or come close to impeaching a president. And I want to talk about those three instances today where Congress has used the most powerful tool in its arsenal, as both Senators Weicker and Representative Hogan talked about. And the three instances were the impeachment but acquittal of President Andrew Johnson in 1868, the near impeachment and resignation of President Nixon, obviously, in 1973, and finally the impeachment but acquittal of President Bill Clinton, most recently in 1998. What I'd like to do is talk briefly about the creation of the power of impeachment and talk about some of the parallels of these three historical events. And finally explain why I see that the Watergate incident is really in a class by itself and is really the scandal, the incident that stands out and that changed the American presidency and our politics and history forever. When the framers of the U.S. Constitution met in Philadelphia in 1787, one thing was clear on their mind. They wanted to avoid a powerful president at all costs. While there were a handful of people such as Alexander Hamilton, who would just as well have preferred that we have a king. For every Hamilton, there were more people on the other side, such as George Mason, who had been president under the Articles of Confederation, who so feared a powerful presidency that he preferred that we have a president by committee to avoid the concentration of power in one person. When the framers finally completed the Constitution, they gave Congress tremendous powers. They gave Congress the exclusive power to enact legislation. They gave Congress the power to override presidential veto and to disapprove of presidential appointments. And indeed, a lot of them feared that what they ended up with was that the president would be merely a vassal or a servant of Congress. But when they got to impeachment, there was virtually not a single dissenting voice that, yes, our president unlike a king, unlike most historical presidents, should be removable by the Congress. George Mason once again spoke for most of the delegates when he asked rhetorically in 1787, "Shall any man be above justice? Above all, shall that man be above who can commit the most extensive injustice?" And finally, Pennsylvania's Ben Franklin suggested that if they didn't provide for impeachment, the only alternative to getting rid of an unacceptable president would be assassination, which is what the experience was from the days of ancient Rome. And eventually, the constitutional framers came up with the language of impeachment for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And odd as it may seem to us today, the framers of 1787, the first thing in their mind really was treason. Back 200 years ago, when the United States was a small, unstable country, an experience such as Benedict Arnold, a traitor to the country during the Revolution, were still fresh in people's minds. The idea that a foreign power might bribe the president was something that they took very seriously. And that's probably what they had foremost in their minds when they were concerned about impeachment. What they did not expect, what did not exist in 1787, was the rise of political parties. And indeed, it would have shocked them to find out that today we often have a president of one political party and a Congress where many or most of the members are of the other political party, the sworn political enemies of the president. And I think the framers of 1787 would be surprised and perhaps relieved to find out that we often have a president of one party and a Congress of the other party, and that Congress does not, the first thing it does is to go and try to impeach the president because he's of a different party. They would be surprised to find out that our system works as well as it does with political parties. But I will suggest that this split in government, a split between the presidency and Congress, is one of the requirements for a successful attempt at impeachment, at least under the most common means that we've attempted to impeach our president 3 times, which is under the high crimes and misdemeanors aspect of the Constitution. Something that was at play both in 1868 with Andrew Johnson, with Nixon in 73, and with Clinton in 1998. So let me talk about a few similarities. First, all 3 impeachment efforts occurred in times of tension, either tension political or otherwise. First, one can see the impeachment of Andrew Johnson in 1868 as being one of the final battles of the Civil War, the great rendering apart of the country, and the culmination of the clash over slavery and the decades of debate in the country over the status of blacks in American society. Although Andrew Johnson was Abraham Lincoln's vice president, unlike Lincoln, Andrew Johnson was a conservative Southern Democrat, not a liberal Northern Republican. And President Andrew Johnson acted like a Southern conservative Democrat. He vetoed post-Civil War legislation to give assistance to freed slaves. He opposed the 14th Amendment, which enshrined in the Constitution constitutional equality for blacks. And Johnson supported the reestablishment of white supremacist governments in the southern states and wanted to remove the biracial governments that the radical Republicans in Congress had established immediately after the Civil War. In effect, Andrew Johnson wanted to limit the Civil War, the effects of the Civil War, to merely be removing slavery, but doing nothing else to change the white supremacist society in the South. The radical Republicans who impeached him wanted to extend the Civil War to transform Southern society. Similarly, Watergate came at the end of a time of tremendous tension as we've heard today from Senator Weicker, came after the Vietnam War, where there was an extraordinary and unprecedented cleaving of American society over the Vietnam War and the tension on American campuses and elsewhere. The tremendous bitterness and hostility that was generated by Vietnam and events related to it. And we still see this bitterness and hostility and dividing of America today in the supposed divide of America into red America, the America of flag-waving conservative Americans, and the supposed blue America of liberal, skeptical Americans. And the Vietnam era also created a remarkable and unprecedented disillusionment with the presidency and people's faith in the president to carry out policy for the, as Bob Woodward said last night, to creating the next generation of what's good. Now, Bill Clinton's impeachment just 5 years ago didn't come during a time of tension, but it came at a time of just about the next best thing, the opposite, at a time of unprecedented peace and prosperity. And this peace and prosperity led zealots on both sides of the aisle to see their political opponents as being essentially the surrogates for foreign powers and foreign threats. By the mid-1990s, the great Cold War that had consumed America since World War II had been won. The economy was booming. The United States found itself without any great threats, either externally or internally. And with the threat of communism gone for the first time in generations, American conservatism, to a large extent, turned towards the cultural war. And issues such as sexual mores and personal behavior rose to the forefront of the debate. And we still see that today to some extent with a current debate about gay marriage. With the failure, however, of the anti-Clinton impeachment effort and the rise of an external threat from 2001, the age of terrorism, I suspect that it's unlikely that we're going to see any similar impeachment effort against, say, President Bush, no matter how bad allegations of cover-up, etc., may arise. Second similarity among the three efforts in impeachment I'd like to point out is that all three impeachment efforts generated the defense of everybody does it, our guy just got caught, which Senator Weicker talked about. In 1973, Senate Republicans tried to get the Ervin Committee's mandate expanded to include previous presidential elections, and to try to investigate reports that Democratic President Lyndon Johnson had bugged Republicans in 1968. Now, that effort failed, but certainly recent subsequent revelations have shown that Democratic President Lyndon Johnson held a backseat to no one in terms of chicanery and political tricks. And Andrew Johnson, back in 1868, was defended on the ground that his view towards the South was merely carrying out the policies and approach of his predecessor, Abraham Lincoln. After all, Lincoln, in his most famous speech, his last inaugural address, called for malice toward none and charity toward all. And some historians have speculated that had Lincoln not been assassinated, it would have been he that the radical Republicans would have tried to trip up. That it was the radical Republicans that Lincoln would have defied, and that Lincoln might have ended up being the target of an impeachment focus of the radical Republicans. And of course, Bill Clinton's sexual escapades were, his defenders said, not any different from presidential randiness throughout history, going back to John F. Kennedy and Warren Harding and Grover Cleveland and who knows who else. And a defense of President Clinton, that his alleged perjury was merely a magnification of a common personal failing, was an echo of a defense of Richard Nixon in 1973 and 74, that his dirty tricks and Watergate cover-up were merely a public exposure of what goes on in the dark side of politics all the time. third and final similarity I'd like to point out is that all three impeachment efforts were plagued by alleged defects in proving that what the president did was indeed illegal, was indeed a crime, a high crime or misdemeanor, as the Constitution requires. Andrew Johnson in 1868 was impeached for violating the Tenure of Office Act by firing his Secretary of War, who opposed Johnson's policies. This statute, the Tenure of Office Act, had been recently adopted by the Republican Congress, in large part in hopes of tripping up President Johnson and finding a ground by which to impeach him. Johnson, by contrast, felt correctly that the statute was probably unconstitutional. And Johnson fired the Secretary of War in hopes that he could bring the issue to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court would rule that this statute was unconstitutional. The radical Republicans beat him to the punch and impeached him, although they did not convict him, before he could get his constitutional argument before the Supreme Court. And likewise with the Clinton impeachment a few years ago. His defenders argued that his minor prevarications and his alleged lying in depositions and before the grand jury were not the kind of little white lies that typically would arise to a criminal prosecution. Our criminal laws cast a wide net over potential criminal activity. Why does it do so? It's because we expect and require that our prosecutors pick and choose those kinds of crimes that are bad enough, that are significant enough to warrant actual prosecution. And the defense of Bill Clinton is that no prosecutor worth his or her gray suit would have bothered to prosecute anyone for the kind of little lies that Bill Clinton may have done in his depositions and grand jury testimony. And of course, with Watergate, the case against Richard Nixon was not a guaranteed success until about the time that Representative Hogan spoke, at the end of July 1974, because of the lack of any substantive evidence that President Richard Nixon had committed a crime of any sort. Merely targeting your enemies and being a sort of a sleazy politician is not a high crime or misdemeanor, Nixon's defenders argued. And one of the sharpest memory that I have of Watergate as a 12-year-old and at the time of the House Judiciary Committee hearings were the Republican defenders demanding that there be specificity in the articles of impeachment. There needed to be specificity. They kept repeating that word. And as a 12-year-old, I learned a new vocabulary term. I didn't know what specificity meant before. And I also found out that my heroes on the Democratic side of the aisle were distressingly reluctant to provide the needed specificity in the impeachment counts. It was only just about the time that Representative Hogan spoke that finally tapes were revealed that proved that President Richard Nixon almost certainly did commit a crime of obstructing justice. So now that I've identified three similarities between the three efforts to impeach President Andrew Johnson in 1868, Richard Nixon in 73-74, Bill Clinton in 98-99, I'd like to finish by highlighting the significant difference between these three efforts, and the difference that makes Watergate by far the most significant of the three scandals, and the most significant lesson for American history and politics. The impeachment of Andrew Johnson back in 1868 exposed for the first time the fact that merely partisan politics, that is, a disagreement over policy, could be a foundation for impeachment, the most powerful tool in the Constitution. But after the trauma and horror of the Civil War, where people shot and killed each other over disagreements, the impeachment of Andrew Johnson really showed us nothing new. The impeachment of President Clinton exposed for the first time the sordid personal life of a president. True, we've seen snippets of it before. Middle America was shocked when they heard some of the first tapes of President Nixon and his constant use of curse words, which are reported in the press as being expletive deleted this, expletive deleted that, which shocked many Americans to find that their president used foul language. But by the time of President Clinton's impeachment in 1998, Americans were a bit more sophisticated or perhaps skeptical. And they viewed President Clinton's failings with, the majority of Americans at least, with a collective yawn. The majority of Americans weren't bothered by what President Clinton did. And I suspect because they saw what President Clinton did, simply perhaps a variation of failings that they have in their own personal lives, or of what family members or friends have had in personal failings in their lives. And they decided, as they would do to a friend or loved one of themselves, to simply turn the other cheek. With Richard Nixon and Watergate, however, what was exposed was not merely the dark side of partisan politics, or the dark side of personal peccadillos, but rather the potential of the American president to radically abuse his presidential and constitutional powers. By leading or acquiescing in dirty tricks, break-ins, hush money, obstruction of justice, and use of institutions such as the CIA and the Justice Department in order to stymie his enemies, the Nixon and Watergate episode exposed to Americans that our supposedly careful constitutional system, where we have this separation of powers between the president, the legislature, and the judiciary, and the supposed checks and balances that we supposedly have in the Constitution, don't always work as well as they should. And that perhaps we'd end up giving the president the powers of tyranny. And if Richard Nixon had succeeded, that perhaps the United States would have slid close to what was called the imperial presidency, or I'd like to think is perhaps allowing the president to be an autocrat when he or she could choose. Fortunately for us, we had institutions such as the media, people like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. We had leaders in Congress such as Lowell Weicker and Larry Hogan. And we had the criminal justice system through the Justice Department that brought prosecutions, and our judiciary who saw those prosecutions through to expose these abuse of presidential power and to put them down before they got out of control. And Watergate also provided us with a warning that resonates today. Today we see that while we have a limited presidential power to some extent, in some areas, such as foreign affairs and the ability to make war, our president has virtually unchecked, unlimited powers. And it'll be interesting to see whether we decide to rethink our handing over of the power to make war that we essentially have given a blank check to the president today. In conclusion, I think we should look at Watergate as being a success and that we overcame the threat to the abusive power of the president to run roughshod over the rest of the country. And the success of exposing this abuse of potential power is the reason why Watergate will be talked about at conferences 100 years from now, and we'll still be writing chapters about it 100 years from now. And we can be certain that 100 years from now, the Bill Clinton impeachment, like the obscure impeachment of Andrew Johnson in 1868, will be reduced to, by comparison, a mere footnote. Thank you very much.